Hey guys, what's up? Shanahan here, back again from Academy.fm. Today we're going to talk about bass processing, a little bit of editing, and touching up on how we can get creative with our layering, where we can cut and mix everything to make it sound as tight as this track has come out. This is referencing one of my tracks called Janjira that I put out a year or two ago. I'm actually using a few different things here to fill in, to show you guys how we can do fills and how we can edit certain parts to make it tighter and even make it sound cleaner than it already is. But again, this is going to be the track we're working on.
We about to turn it up.
Alright, so that's going to be the drop we're working on. Kind of an electro vibe slash big room going on, you know, kind of a mix of genres in there. So that's why I put this track together. I was really happy to kind of touch on different genres. But a main thing I want to point out today is touching base on a few different processing tips to make something like this work, and also how we can bounce things into place. How can we utilize waves and working in audio as opposed to just working in our MIDI instruments, which is fine too, but there's an advantage to bouncing things into place to get a little bit more creative with the editing. Let's take a look at our bass lines here. You guys can see in the MIDI there's a blank spot on 1-4, 2-4, etc. on the fourth, meaning I leave an open spot in my MIDI for my snare drum to come through clean and punch through. Now, cool thing about the snare too, you guys can hear there's a pretty significant amount of reverb. Now, generally speaking on these type of tracks, I would not recommend putting a ton of reverb on your bass lines. Now, it could be different if you're using maybe a percussion topper, maybe a synth top. You can kind of get away with adding a little bit of reverb and space to the bass line, but generally speaking, to get rid of mud and any unclear basses, you don't want too much reverb going on. So if we look at one of these patches that I have a lot of reverb going on, we want to start to get rid of that a little bit. So basically patch 4 from Silent is going to have that little bit of almost pre-delay or late delay rather reverb reflection here. If we take that off, you're going to feel that snare come through a lot cleaner. And this is what I do on most of my drops that are like this. If there's a 4, there's usually the 2-4 snare, most of the time. So when my 4 comes through, meaning this snare right here, I want to give space to that snare. I don't want too much going on. Same thing as you're working on a future bass track or maybe a track that has trap to it. You want, when your chords shut off, your snare drum really wants to come through clean in the mix and it wants to punch through. So if you have a lot of reverb tail going on, you're going to get too much of a muddy signal. So make sure the reverb is cleaned up in that section. So we still have a little bit of reverb, but we've calmed it down a little bit. This is going to help with the punch and clarity of your bass. So now let's check all 4 again. So now that snare is going to come through that much more punchier, you could say. So now let's go to the snare and suck the life out of that. We don't want too much tail on a snare drum. When we're doing drops like this, you got to think punchy, clarity, power, energy. You got to think of it all, and there's a thin line to putting it all together, right? It's not as easy said and done, but there's ways to achieve kind of getting there quicker, and you need to think of short plates and shorter sounds. So shorter kick drum, longer bass lines, shorter snare drum so it comes through clean and hard, because you got to remember your bass line, especially like this with a MIDI like this, it's taking up a lot of the spectrum. There's a lot going on. So when my snare is hitting here on the 2 and it's going to hit here on the 2, we have that bass line there, so they're going to hit each other. So make sure your snare is short and punchy. Otherwise, you're going to lose a little bit of the mix value. You're going to kind of get that muddy feeling. So let's go to our snare and put a noise gate on that to shorten it up. So I want a tiny bit of reverb there, or that kind of atmospheric feel. It is giving value to the sound, don't get me wrong. My main point is that when these are tightened up like this, my bass lines tighten up, my snare is now tightened up, we're going to have more room for other elements to create a little more power and energy. This should feel a little tighter.
We about to turn it up.
So it does have a cleaner feeling. But now that you hear that, you want to go back and add a little more reverb. That reverb was adding some sort of value to it. We just had it too overdone. So that's why I want to show you guys those little details. You got to find that thin line. I'll usually spend all day on, once I develop my idea and the bass line's strong, the drop is kind of, you know, the whole sketch is there. You're feeling good about it. And now you got to go into that couple hours of detail work of shortening samples, extending MIDI, you know, changing the length of MIDI. That, you know, that slight bit from left to right, shorter or longer, can be the difference between your record being good or great. So make sure you guys are definitely paying attention to that stuff. As far as layering to what I add on top of stuff like this, if you guys really want a unique bass line like this outside of the sound design I did on the individual channels, there's also percussion and what I call noise runners on top. If you guys listen to this, it's going to be a sampled noise hit. And what that's doing is providing top-end presence to our bass line. Our bass line is a lot of low, mid, raw style sound design. So we need to somehow give high-end present if we don't have maybe a synth or something, maybe a vocal. If we don't have that, we know this noise has to add a lot more value to the sound here if you hear it on and off. So it's a huge difference. That's giving value. It's giving more power and clarity to the bass line. You know, it gives that high-end presence that you need in the mix. And I'm doing the same thing with a snare drum. This is adding percussion to the entire rhythm of the track. It is on the same exact MIDI and rhythm as everything else. It's just a percussion or a snare piece. So that's following the same exact pattern. That's giving more what I call swing and kind of power to the bass line. If you guys look at my MIDI notes, you guys can see these are actually swinging. These are not on grid. This is also a unique way to create bass lines. Everyone thinks on grid. Well, you don't always have to be exactly on the pattern and exactly on the grid, because then you get very robotic and plastic. You know, try to stay more natural and organic, and you give swing to a lot of instruments and can create something pretty unique if you do that.
About to turn it up.
So let's look at our bass fills. As you guys can see, I have reverse synth fills. What I do is provide, if I hit a snare chord hit, like I'm on G, if I do my G chord hit, I will then bounce it down and I will reverse it and I'll add reverb to it. So it creates a reverse synth effect. I use that all the time to create fills. Don't always think of fills as percussion, you know, tom drums, snares, 808s. It doesn't always have to be that. Think of fills as how can you fill it in with atmosphere, synths, instruments, all that type of stuff, reverse hits. I'm using a lot of stuff going on here to fill in the gaps of my bass line. And the bass growls I'm using from our cymatics packs are basically providing a little bit of that fill on the 4 and the 1. I have one of my patches from Sylenth, basically a black mask type acid hit. So those are filling in gaps in my bass line. Do I always want those happening? No, because I want to keep the listener tied in with this groove. You know, you don't want to put these every single place or on top of these. You know, you're going to get a little bit of a chaotic listener. You know, the listener might be a little confused by that. So make sure you're subtle with your bass fills if you're using them. They need to be there for a purpose, to provide fill or to provide energy to the entire rhythm. And lastly, guys, always try to create a layer. You know, layering with bass is touchy-feely. You got to be careful, because if you add too many layers, you can completely ruin of, maybe a couple layers that were really significant in there. You can completely ruin it. It's just like compression. If you don't need to add compression, don't do it. So with layering, be really careful with how many ones you're adding. It might seem like I have 7 or 8 layers, but there's not. They're doing certain different things. They're all taking the spot of the spectrum that they're supposed to be in. One is a noise, snare, I got a talk one, and then I have a lot of 4 fat layers that are working together. This one's really light on the low mids and is just really kind of talking its way through the entire bass to make it have movement. You can hear it slightly in the left and right signal. So before we sign off, let's look at some of our processing we did on the bass line there. If we go into our mixer. Now, what I essentially do, before I dive into this mixer, what I essentially do with the mix when I'm processing stuff, if I find a good bass line right off the bat, say I start with 1 layer like I usually do and maybe my kick drum, if I process that bass and it's sounding really full and I've got like a good distortion plugin on it, and I got maybe a couple third-party plugins that are working well, I will reapply those over to my next few layers. You guys can see my second layer in the bass has the exact same plugins. I've tried a couple few that I blacked out here and bypassed. They just didn't work. Trial and error. But what I'm saying is, if there's something working, why change it, right? It's a great model to think about. Reapply the bass lines that are working. They're going to be different sound design, but they're going to have the same processing on them. So if we look at the bass 3 and 4, these are pretty simple because these are underlying basses. They're hidden in the mix. See how subtle that is? It's really low. But something like 4, that's my big kind of distorted bass, that needs a lot of processing. That needs to come out in the mix. I processed that through the Maserati plugin to give that guitar edge. That's going to give a lot of crunch to it. And I'm cutting the lows pretty good on this. I'm not allowing the kick and the bass to collide. That's something you need to really keep in mind when doing pretty much any genre of music. Remember to really keep the ratio and correlation between kick and bass tight as possible. Everything has to be rolled off very precisely. So the last thing I really like to do on my bass lines is I love giving overdrive. A lot of people kind of forget about the benefit of distortion or kind of using crunch or overdrive signal. Everyone kind of, there's a couple of producers I've heard from that try to stay away from the red, try to stay out of that overdrive signal, which I can understand that side, but there's also the flip side of, there's such a good thing as, overdrive being good or being too far in the red. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you go look at guys like Danik, a lot of his stuff is pushed in the red and just gone as far as it goes. But if the mix down is clear and clean, you can get away with it. It works. So these 2 layers at the top have that overdrive plugin on them. Without them, it would be kind of a dull sound. It wouldn't have the power and punch to the bass lines. So you guys can see how much, that 2% difference there is a major amount when it gets in the mix. Without it, they will be sitting out of the mix, as in just not being heard, kind of a pointless layer. So make sure you're paying attention to tiny little details like that. Lastly, the sidechain I'm using is the LFO tool. Now I use a pretty crazy curve on some of these, and I don't always apply or supply the same exact curve to every layer. Now, some people will say you should do that. Some will say there's no right or wrong answer, to be honest with that. Certain layers are going to have a different swing than the other, and you can achieve that by applying different sidechain settings to each layer. You can see how much is being tucked away from that sound. So side note, before we sign off here today, make sure when you're doing your sidechain that it is making sense compared to your kick. If your kick drum is a short kick drum, as in it doesn't have a long length tail, you can see this is pretty short, then you want to bring your sidechain curve over to the left in order to find that kick. Your kick is going to be in here, therefore your bass should not be ducking way over here. You're going to have a big blank spot in the mix. So make sure you got a short kick, you're doing a short sidechain, so that's only sidechain the bass short. Long kick, then we would do a long sidechain. That pays off a big amount in 4/4 dance music. That's got to be very precise, and you got to be really accurate and detailed with that.
We about to turn it up.
All right, guys, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed. As always, let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.